In the first video we did on the Jaredites, I proposed the theory that the Jaredites and the Nephites left from the same harbor. Although this is just a theory, it's the first model of the Jaredite trail that's actually based on some evidence. Still, there's one question that begs to be asked. How could the Jaredites have possibly crossed the great empty quarter of Arabia, the world's largest sand desert? In this video, we will explore one way they could have accomplished this.
In the age of the Jaredites, camels had not yet been domesticated. Today it would be impossible to travel down eastern Arabia and across the empty quarter with any animal other than the camel. The wheel and cart had been in widespread use in Mesopotamia in Jaredite times, but the only animals available to them would have been donkeys, horses, and oxen. However, today, none of these animals could survive a crossing of Arabia. The question remains, could these animals have made the journey through Arabia at the time of the Jaredites? To determine this, George Potter and Richard Wellington knew they had to retrace the ancient trail and find out for themselves. For the Jaredites to have passed through Arabia with donkeys means they would have needed a level terrain for carts, a source of food for the donkeys, and of course water. Camels played a great role in the evolution of caravan routes in Arabia. The best routes were identified by trial and error, and these routes were thereafter faithfully followed for thousands of years. And why were these trails selected as the best routes? Because the route was good terrain for pack animals, contained places to obtain fodder to feed their beasts of burden, and they were sources of water plentiful enough to sustain the travelers and animals on the trail. The Jaredites traveled into Arabia before these trails had been developed. However, they had the Lord to guide them along the best course. It only makes sense that the Lord would have taken the Jaredites along the same routes that would later be discovered as the most favorable by caravaneers. At least, this is our thinking. Using this logic, one could work backwards to determine the most likely trail for the Jaredites from Babel through eastern Arabia, then across the empty quarter and on to Korori, where George and Richard believe the Jaredites built their ships. We propose to do just that. The oldest maps showing the trails of eastern Arabia are Ptolemy's maps that were reproduced in the 15th century. The leading scholar on the ancient trails in Arabia is Nigel Groom. In retracing the ancient trail from Mesopotamia to southern Arabia, Groom matched Ptolemy's place names to modern sites. Groom suggested that the trail from Babylon to Gara, the last major city before entering the empty quarter, was by way of Sada in Kuwait, a place called Gaiso, then via the Arabian oases of Wadi al-Miyah, Taj, and Ain Dar, and finally Gara, now called Hofuf. Richard and George believe that Groom is probably mistaken in his identification of Gaiso. That area today is called Gara, meaning the bald land, or area with no vegetation. We suggest that a more likely place for Gaiso was Qaryat Aulia, the traditional place of entry for caravans from Iraq and Kuwait into Arabia. Qaryat Aulia is found in a very fertile valley, and is much more likely candidate for the Jaredites to have passed through with their flock. The Book of Mormon notes that the Jaredites entered a wilderness where no man had ever been, and as we would suspect, archaeologists have confirmed. Most of the towns that grew at the oasis along the ancient trail did not exist in Jaredite times.
We were not able to start retracing the Jaredite trail from the remains of Babylon due to restrictions that have been placed on Westerners by the Iraqi government. So Richard and I decided to start our retracement of the Jaredite trail at Gure Aulia, the traditional customs and port of entry on the trail from Baghdad into Arabia.
Our explorers visited the old customs house at Qaryat al-Ulia and then started their long journey south. They decided to follow Bedouin trails from Qaryat al-Ulia to the town of Nata in the Wadi Mia. Both are names Groom believes were on the trail from Babylon to southern Arabia. As they crossed over the hills between the two wadis, they noticed donkeys and goats grazing. This confirmed their belief that there was enough animal food or fodder to support any animals the Jaredites would have brought with them this far into Arabia. About halfway through their 50-mile Bedouin trail to Nata, they had to stop for one of those all too frequent occurrences. The first night they set up camp 14 miles west of the Wadi Mia, next to some caves that contained mastodon bones. From the camp they could see Bedouin tents and their large camel herd. In the morning they noticed Bedouin boys on the crest of the hill in back of their camp. They seemed to have come from nowhere. Slowly the boys got up the courage to visit them. Richard and George gave the boys some brownies, and in turn they gave our explorers some wild fruits and mushrooms they had found that morning.
But grow out here in the desert. When it rains, these grow large. You see a crack in the ground, and they dig there and they find these fuga, or truffles, which are, of course, gourmet food anywhere. Shukran. Okay. Okay. Thank you very much. Bye now.
Masalama.
Those are actually truffles.
Yeah.
Before continuing down the trail from Babylon, George and Richard explored the Mastodon caves. Richard identified the bones of mastodons, the ancient hairy elephants, hippopotami, and other animals. These bones were evidence that in times past, Arabia had much more rainfall and could sustain large grazing animals.
We've backed the truck into the cave and I'm up on the roof of the car so that we can get more of an idea of what we're looking at here with this jawbone, which is here in the roof of the cavern. What we'll be looking at is a jawbone which will equate to this part of the mandible of the animal. This part here is the condyle where it inserted onto the skull. As we run around here, we're now at the angle of the mandible, and as we run here, we're running forwards along the body of the mandible. This part here is a tooth, a molar biting tooth, which would be here. Here would be a muscle insertion where the jaw muscle would join on and pull the jawbone up and down. Okay, we realise that the jawbone and the tooth that we saw are probably a young animal because we just found another tooth which is considerably larger. It's this one here. And what you're looking at is the biting surface of the molar tooth of this animal looking straight down on it. You have the outside pattern here, which is in dark flint, and this is the enamel that was on the outside of the tooth. And then the central portion of the tooth in these little areas here, where the enamel would wear away as it would be eating, would have been the dentine of the tooth. And this is in a white sort of chalky material. And this tooth is about the span of my hand. Well, some might consider an argument against the Jaredites having crossed Arabia down to the Indian Ocean to be that there wouldn't have been enough fodder for their animals. Camels weren't domesticated at that time, and so they would have been using donkeys as pack animals, which need a lot more fodder than camels do. And yet we can see here that after the rains, the desert is really green. The desert of Saudi Arabia is not a desert because it's made up of sand, silicon dioxide. It's a desert because it doesn't have any water. When there is water, the land is really productive. In fact, it's not silicon dioxide here, but limestone. And so if you place water on the soil here, it's really fertile and can produce a big number of crops. This probably gives us more of an indication of what it would look like in Jaredite times, when we know that there was more rainfall than there is at present.
After exploring the caves, they continued south to the ancient caravan halt called Nata. Just outside the village is the ruins of a 20th century fort built by the founder of Saudi Arabia, King Abdulaziz, who had stopped at Nata on his way to his victorious raid on Riyadh. Here, George and Richard met a man who told them that the name of the Wadi Mia meant the Valley of Water, so named because the water table was only 10 feet deep. As they explored the remains of old Nata, they were greeted by Mr. Muhammad and his son, who in turn gave them a tour of the ruins and showed the explorers the layout of a traditional Arab home. The main room on the right had no interior walls. It was the primary room, or majlis, in which the family eats, does chores, and where the father entertained his male visitors. In the room, the father would build a fire so he could brew Arabic coffee for his guests. The coffee would be served with dates. The windows near the top of the high walls were used to vent the smoke from the fire. The second room, on the left and detached from the main hall, was smaller. It served as both sleeping quarters as well as the room where the mother would visit with her female guests. In the center was a small court area used as a garden, a place to wash, and for sleeping on hot summer nights. Behind the court were two very small rooms that were used for sleeping quarters. As they left town, Muhammad stopped them once again.
Great, shukran, thank you. This is Saudi hospitality. Thank you.
About 2 miles west of Wadi Mia, they stopped at an archaeological site called Ship Rock, a hill used as a natural fortress in ancient times. The pottery they found at Ship Rock dates to around 2000 BC. The cliff walls of the fortress are approximately 30 feet high and are impossible to climb without ropes, since the erosion over time left overhangs around the entrance to the hill. Ship Rock gave the explorers a window on how insecure people must have been in early settlements in Arabia. If an army approached, using the Oasis Trail, the residents must have sought refuge in fortified hills like Ship Rock. What made this fortress so difficult to attack was the unique way one had to enter the fort, only through a very narrow cave.
Next to the entry of the cave, we have written on the rock in Arabic, dangerous, with an arrow pointing into the cave. Let's go in and find out why. Inside the cave here, it seems almost impossible to pass through here. At the other end of this very low passage, maybe 30-35 feet ahead, we can see some light coming through. Now if we look straight ahead, there's only about 8 inches worth of clearance, and I'm not going to be able to make it through there. However, Richard's already gone before me, and he's found a passage. I wonder how many cobras we share this cave with.
Working our way through this part. This is all too narrow to get through. I'm just kind of holding this against the roof of the tunnel here, and there's some light at the end. And that's what we're going to be aiming for now. Here's George making his way out and into the daylight. And this is where we're going to be going.
This ladder gives us all the confidence in the world. We notice either the rungs are broken out, or they're partly broken out, or they're in the process of snapping. So we have an old wood ladder that's in 3 sections, roped together, and then at the top, it doesn't actually make it to the top of this sort of a well shaft. There's ropes that you have to take from there up the rest of the way. So let's go on up.
From atop Ship Rock, they could see that winter rains had formed shallow lakes in the wadi. Scientists have studied the climate in Arabia in ancient times and found that there was more rainfall in the period of the Jaredites than there is today. It is reasonable to assume that these lakes must have been much larger and existed year-round at the time of the Jaredites. From the Wadi Mia, they traveled another 20 miles southwest to the remains of the town of Thaj. Here they were surprised to see that the ruins were situated between 2 lakes. The Book of Mormon talks of the Jaredites crossing seas that were in the wilderness. These lakes were much bigger at the time of the Jaredites, and crossing from their northern end to the southern end could fit the description recorded in the Book of Mormon. Another, perhaps a more straightforward explanation, is that these shallow lakes are only a foot or 2 deep and can be crossed on foot. Nigel Groom identified the village of Ain Dar as the next stop on the trail. Upon entering the village, the explorers saw no evidence that it had existed since ancient times. It was not until they stopped at the northern outskirts of the village that they found signs of ages past. Here, below their feet, were hundreds of pieces of pottery shards. George and Richard continued south toward what seemed the obvious next stop, the oasis of Hofuf. Certainly, the Jaredites would have stopped at the natural springs that gush forth at Hofuf. It is the largest desert oasis in the world, and as Groom believes, was probably the important ancient trading center called Gara before it took on its current name of Hofuf. Its dates are praised as the finest in the world, and today Hofuf is a favorite marketplace for locals and foreigners living in Saudi Arabia. Hofuf's mosque in Ibrahim's fort has the world's largest dome made entirely of mud bricks. Even today, once a traveler heads south from Hofuf, the vast scope of the Arabian desert will begin to absorb his thoughts. Our travelers were no different. What desolation! Their next destination was Jabrin, the last oasis before entering the empty quarter. About 2 hours south of Hofuf, George and Richard stopped at the village of Harad for lunch. They also considered getting their hair cut until they noticed another spelling error. An hour later, they reached Jabrin. Today, there is a small town at the oasis, though this oasis was probably not settled until well after the Jaredite period. Here, our explorers finally found a place where they could get a haircut. From Jabrin, the trail turned east-southeast for 160 miles until it reached the famous Karkir Trail, the only known trail that crossed the empty quarter before the advent of the automobile. That night they camped on the edges of the empty quarter and wondered how the Jaredites could have ever crossed the wasteland before them. The Book of Mormon states that the Jaredites crossed a desert, even, quote, that quarter where there never had man been, unquote. Could the Jaredites have taken the Karkir Trail through the empty quarter, so called because there is no evidence that anyone has ever permanently lived there? How could the Jaredites have crossed this hellish wilderness? Andrew Taylor wrote in his book, Traveling the Sands, quote, for centuries, the 200,000 square miles of desert at the heart of Arabia were unknown and unexplored. Right into the 20th century, the empty quarter, or Rub al-Khali, stretched away into the distance, vast and mysterious, an impenetrable barrier to travel across the heart of the Arabian Peninsula. The challenge implicit in that apparent impenetrability, of course, was one compelling reason for the fascination the desert held for generations of adventurers. As Everest did to later explorers, the empty quarter stood as a silent reproach to their daring." End quote. It was not until Bertram Thomas crossed the empty quarter with the help of Bedou guides had anyone in modern history crossed it and lived to write about it. The year was 1930. Thomas and his guides successfully retraced the Karkir Trail, but in the process they had almost died from thirst and starvation. To find out how the Jaredites could have survived a crossing of the empty quarter, our explorers turned to the one man who probably knew the empty quarter better than any Westerner. His name is Rob Morrison, and to our good fortune, Rob is a member of the LDS Church. Brother Morrison has a unique profession. He is a geo-surveyor. Rob can measure from any point on the surface of the earth to the world's true center point. For 10 years he has been surveying the empty quarter for Saudi Aramco Oil Company. Rob knows the empty quarter like the back of his hand and can talk for an entire evening sharing the stories of the times he has nearly died in the sands. The Bedouin tribes that live on the edges of the empty quarter call Rob al-Shaweba. On his surveying expeditions, he and his Arab crew take with them all their fuel, water, and food, including fresh meat of the hoof. To avoid sand vipers and scorpions, they sleep on the top of their trucks. To gain a better understanding of how the Jaredites could have crossed the empty quarter, George and Richard interviewed Rob. Rob indicated that the only trail the Jaredites could have crossed the empty quarter with was the Karkir Trail. His reasoning was simple but conclusive. The terrain to the east of the trail was covered with red sand dunes which reached heights of over 900 feet. To cross them would exhaust any traveler. To the trail's west were the even more hazardous white dunes, consisting of very soft sands. The Bedouins call these dunes the sands of death. Other dangers of the east included large areas of quicksand. Rob related how experienced desert travelers die in the empty quarter each year. He has developed safety rules that are followed by all Aramco workers in the empty quarter. If you violate these rules, you will not leave the empty quarter alive. To our surprise, Rob noted that water would not have been a problem for the Jaredites. He explained that there are ancient wells called khors that the Bedouins had dug along the trail. Finally, Rob noted that the Bedouins could have crossed the Karkir Trail on camels because the trail had enough camel fodder. The trail avoided large dunes by staying in the lowlands. Here, below the dunes, desert brush can grow, which in turn provides food for camels. After interviewing Rob, George and Richard knew that the only way the Jaredites could have crossed the empty quarter was along the Karkir Trail, and, since camels were not available, it would have been with donkeys. When the explorers asked Rob if someone could cross the empty quarter today on donkeys, he laughed and said, "No way." However, he then rubbed his chin and said, there's a well near the Karkir Trail called the Well of the Donkey." The fact is, donkeys did cross the Karkir Trail at the time of the Jaredites. Scientists have shown that more rain fell then than today. It is believed that the empty quarter was once green, covered with grass and lakes. In his book, The Road to Ubar, Nicholas Clapp gives this description of travel from Shisur in the era of the Jaredites. Shisur was one of the halts on the Karkir Trail. Quote, "Around 3000 BC, the range of the frankincense tree, encouraged by abundant rains, may well have extended out to and even beyond the spring at Shisur. In any case, the surrounding oasis was an ideal staging area for caravans heading north. It provided fodder for donkeys and dates for their drivers. Forming at Shisur and striking north, the donkey caravans followed a trail of springs and seasonal lakes spaced no more than a day apart." Unquote. The next morning, George and Richard began their attempt to cross the empty quarter. The explorers filled their gas tanks at the last pumping station before reaching the Karkir Trail. The remote outpost was called Horse's Gate. As crude as the station was, it proved interesting. Here they met two desert pirates. Their profession was running contraband into Saudi Arabia by avoiding the highways and using the desert trails. They showed Richard the equipment they used in order to traverse the empty quarter.
120 litres. And then underneath here, this is where the water comes out. Do you see that? Look at that. Great. Okay, ممتاز.
هذه عمان هنا. هذا كله دبي.
Hey, خلاص. He's trying to load it right to the top for you, but we don't need that.
وين تشتغلون؟
And good conditions, 100 kilos car to car.
في HF.
Okay, VHF radio here.
هذا HF.
And then this is a high frequency radio. And
HF.
and
كله كرة أرضية أمريكا أوروبا كله.
he can get the whole of the kingdom. He can get to the States and Europe with this as well. It's pretty impressive. The antenna's about 2 stories high on the back of his truck here. This is a real desert vehicle. It's great.
Yeah.
This is Wajid Zain.
On parting, their Bedou desert pirates shared with them some ek, the name used for dried camel and goat yogurt. The fingerprints in the cheese are an essential part of the drying process. Richard critiques the offering.
Try and eat a little bit. Alright, bitter. Oh, that'll keep me awake tonight.
Some 10 miles down the road from Horse's Gate, they found the Karkir Trail and headed south. They were excited about finally being in the heart of the empty quarter. They found the terrain exactly like Rob Morrison had told them, a rather flat roadbed with rolling and small dunes to cross every mile or so. To their east and west were white dunes. Rob had warned them that the red sands were hard, but the white dunes, called the sands of death, were very soft.
Driving. We're doing 80 clicks at the moment on the bottom of the dunes, but once we go up the dunes we virtually stop, so we're just trying to keep momentum going. We had rain earlier this year, so the sand's pretty compacted. We've hardly aired down at all for this trip. In the summer you'd have to air right down just to be able to move on this sand. Here we go, we're in trouble. We're out of it. There we go, okay.
Approximately 50 miles into the trail, George and Richard decided to investigate the dunes to their west. It was a mistake for two reasons. First, they got stuck in the soft sands. This, however, was only a momentary inconvenience. Second, to reach the dunes, they drove through extremely hard and dry desert brush called dakaka. Driving through brush in other parts of Arabia had caused no problems. However, in the empty quarter, where water is so scarce and the temperature is so hot, the brush becomes as hard and sharp as a knife. In a few minutes, they dug themselves out and headed on down the trail. They traveled only another 30 miles before disaster struck. The entire side of a tire blew out. On checking the other tires, they found that they all had large cuts in their sides. The desert brush had shredded their tires.
We're quite a ways out here on the Jakaka Trail, but this is as far as we're going on this trip. We lowered the pressure in the tires to get better traction on the sand, but as a result, one of the tires is split out on the side, or has a leak, and so we're now on our spare. I think we'll head back to civilization from here. That'd be the prudent thing to do. We'll see you as we come out of the trail in Oman.
George and Richard had crossed more than half the empty quarter and had driven deep into the Karkir Trail. Rather than repeating what they had already done and knowing they could not cross from Saudi Arabia into Oman using the desert trails, they decided to fly to Oman and pick up the trail from the Oman border south. Here the trail continued through large sand dunes, finally opening into a wide plain. The trail eventually came to the village of Shisr. From Shisr, the Jaredites could have taken the trail over the Kamar Mountains and to the shoreline of the Indian Ocean. This last part of the trail would have essentially been the same route traveled by Nephi to the natural harbor at Khor Rori 2,000 years later. Many believe that this harbor was the famous biblical port of Ophir, and Ophir, you will remember from our first video, was the brother of biblical Jared.
Discover more about the Book of Mormon through science and exploration by subscribing to this channel, or you can visit our website, christinperu.com, where you can learn about our annual Book of Mormon tours to Peru. I'll be your guide. Thank you.